All right, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today for our colloquium with Dr. Daniël Lakens. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And also like to point out that people are joining us from other parts of the world today, and to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands as well. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Daniël Lakens. Joins us virtually all the way from Amsterdam, where it is just past 9:30. So we thank Daniel for being willing to meet with us so late. He's an associate professor in the Human Technology Interaction Group at Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands. He received his PhD in social psychology from Utrecht University in 2010. So his work has included both empirical and statistical and methodological work. So in his empirical work, he studied how people use concrete information to structure thoughts about abstract concepts. And in his statistical and methodological work, he's written lots of papers on how we can improve research practice, including adopting open science practices, ways we can maybe plan out studies in more thoughtful ways than is what is typically done, in ways that we can use more informative methods to analyze data and interpret results. So you're likely thinking those topics sound incredibly broad, but I think that's indicative of Daniel's work. So rather than focusing on very specific questions that maybe only a handful of researchers will experience, I would say addresses very large questions that I think are widely applicable virtually to anyone who uses quantitative analysis, not only in psychology, but other fields. And in doing so, I think his work has been very useful and impactful. He's also a very well-known and skilled teacher, not only for his university, but also with his various workshops, online courses, tutorial blog posts, YouTube videos, et cetera, et cetera. I suspect many of us here today have consulted his materials at some point. I can personally say that I have on numerous occasions, and I've always found them very, very helpful for my own understanding. So I'm personally very thankful for that and happy to have Daniel here. And I hope you all are as well. In any case, please join me in virtually welcoming Daniel.
Thanks so much, Jason. Thanks, appreciate it. So today I'll talk a little bit about statistical methods, but maybe from a slightly different perspective than how to do certain things, but taking a little bit of a step back and reflecting on what we're doing and how we are working on improving the way that we use statistics. And a while ago, there was a movement that's called the new statistics. And the idea was that we're going to improve the way that we do statistics. And the title references this. So I think maybe it says something about my sense of humor, but I think this is slightly funny that you can think about this as the new heuristics, which is a warning. It's not saying that this is happening, but I want to warn for the way that we work in our field. And so that's I guess the main theme that I want to address. I think that one of my favorite quotes that summarizes this main theme that I want to address is about how we learn, not through a very careful understanding of what we're actually doing, but we learn a lot through norms or maybe observational learning. I definitely remember that when I was a PhD student or a postdoc, I would just look at other papers and just imitate what was done there, even up to the level where I would interpret a statistical test by copying language that somebody else used as well, and never really understanding exactly why this was the right way to do it, but just sort of copying these things. And turns out that this is a very long tradition in science, a very long tradition way of working. And I love this quote by Berkeley. It's from 1735. And he writes that people learn the elements of science from others, and every learner hath deference more or less to authority, especially the young learners, few of that kind caring to dwell long upon principles, but inclining rather to take them upon trust, and things early admitted by repetition become familiar, and this familiarity at length passeth for evidence. So this is a way of working where we imitate other people. We don't really dwell upon principles, especially young learners, right? We don't really get to the core of certain things, but we repeat them, we see what other people do, and after a while, we just take this as a good enough thing, right? Because we're so familiar with it, we think, yeah, I mean, there must be a good reason that we're doing this, which is not always the case. So I guess the main point that I'll make, and I'll provide some illustrations throughout, and in the discussion we can talk about this some more, is that I think we will not really improve the way that we're doing our science if what we end up doing in this time, when there's a lot of reflection on the way that we work, that during this time we just replace old heuristics by new heuristics. And I think there's a bit of a risk that we're doing this. And I'll give some examples of this. Maybe it's entertaining to sort of take a look at how we actually work. So I want to take one example throughout this talk, which is about sample size justification. It's a topic that I'm interested in. I am long overdue revising a paper on this, but the preprint has been online for a while. And my revisions are behind, but it's an interesting topic, how we actually justify sample size. So take a moment and think about this for yourself, right? If you think about how you're gonna justify the sample size for your next study, what is your approach here? And this is an area where we have definitely learned a lot. I think many people have learned a lot over the past years. So I think that's great, right? I can tell you what I used to do. So that wasn't good, right? Those are the old heuristics. When I was a PhD student, what I typically did is I just looked in the literature. I saw which sample sizes other people used. And then I thought, well, let's just do the same thing, right? This is maybe actually even a slightly fancy version of what I used to do, because we also just had benchmark heuristics where we would say 15 people in each group. That's perfectly fine. Or 20 people in each group if you want to do a fancy study. But otherwise, we may just look at an existing paper and say, well, they use this much people, so we will just do the same thing. Now, this approach of using heuristics is very popular. There are papers that describe these heuristics, and we'll see in a couple of slides that these papers are incredibly popular. But I also think that we should be a little bit careful in relying on these things. Right. So again, by repetition, they become familiar, and this familiarity we take at a certain moment as truth. But let's not just take them sort of as truth based on repetition, but let's go down the rabbit hole and see where these recommendations sometimes come from. So here is a paper that we'll see in a couple of slides. It's cited like 2,000 times, and it gives a lot of recommendations of which sample sizes you should use. Here, they say, well, you know, although there are more complex formula, the general rule of thumb that if you have a relationship or regression, you should use no less than 50 participants for a correlation or regression. And then they cite Green, 1991. Green, 1991 provides a comprehensive overview of the procedures used, and he suggests N of about 50 plus 8 multiplied by the numbers of predictors. So that means at least like 50, maybe a little bit more than 50. Sounds very nice, right? This is exactly the kind of heuristic that doesn't require a deeper understanding of things, but that makes you feel like, okay, yeah, I can use this, I can cite this paper, and then I'm done. But let's just, for the fun of it, actually read Green 1991. I mean, I know we're not supposed to do this. I mean, we are basically done in terms of satisfying a reviewer, right? We've done everything that we need. We have a paper. The paper tells us what to do. There's a reference and everything, and it seems all solid, and you know, there are formulas and things, so it's lovely. So we're not supposed to do this, but let's just go crazy and let's take a look at what Green 1991 actually says. All right. So here we see that the conclusion in this paper says, in summary, no specific minimum number of subjects or minimum ratio of subjects to predictors was supported. So in this paper, it looked at many different rules of thumbs and different approaches, and none of these were supported. And then he writes, the general rule of thumb of n more than 50 plus 8 multiplied by the number of predictions was seen as more accurate than these simpler rule of thumbs. However, he also discusses a new rule of thumb that's much more accurate than this one. And even for this more accurate one, he says, although it requires that researchers estimate the effect size they wish to detect, so that requires extra input, not just a number, but you need to start computing things. And then he concludes, an argument could be made that this new two-step rule of thumb is sufficiently complex that researchers could almost as easily do a power analysis to determine their sample size. Researchers are encouraged to conduct such power analysis. So that's the take-home message of this paper. That's not really the same as the summary of the earlier one. Okay, interesting. Thanks, Mr. Green, for this pretty decent recommendation to conduct a power analysis. But even Green, if we then take a look at where did he get these 50, this rule of thumb of a 50 plus a little bit multiplied by the number of predictors, where did he get this from? All right, so we dig a little bit further in this paper, and then he writes, according to Gohan, 1988, a typical study in the behavioral sciences would have a medium effect size, and the minimum number of subjects required for studies with this effect size, according to table 1, is 53. All right, sounds interesting, but let's take a look at the claim in this paper now by Green 1991, because he is referencing Gohan, and Gohan says a typical study in the behavioral sciences would have a medium effect size. Okay, so are we going to trust this? I mean, Gohan is a pretty trustworthy person, right? I mean, maybe this is good. Let's take a look. So now we open Gohan. What does Gohan write? Gohan says, many effects sought in personality, social, and clinical psychological research are likely to be small effects, as here defined, both because of the attenuation, invalidity of the measures employed, and the subtlety of the issues frequently encountered. So we really see that there's a recommendation that's a very easy to use heuristic based on a paper that actually makes a completely different claim, but says, yeah, this rule of thumb is sort of useful, assuming that, given the fact that Gohan says that most effects are medium. And then we go one level back, and Gohan also doesn't say that most effects are medium. He says most effects are small. There is no basis here of this heuristic at all. And I, would love to hear anybody come up with a heuristic that we regularly use that has a solid basis. So I'll give you a heuristic if you want to use a heuristic, and that is all heuristics are wrong. That's my heuristic. And by all means, falsify it by showing me a heuristic that actually makes sense. But this is the things that we're building on. But very often there's nothing if you dig a little deeper. So I find this interesting. Now, just to point out that this doesn't mean that making these easy recommendations is not an incredibly successful approach to getting a highly cited paper. This paper is cited more than 2,000 times. It's lovely, This is a very good strategy in general. If you, are in it for your H index, I can highly recommend writing a paper that would have something like a title like no need for power analysis or pre-registration or measurement validation. Everything will work out fine. That's a great title for a paper, and I'm definitely sure they will be highly cited. I'm not even really joking, because this is a paper that recently a bachelor student of mine looked at. How is this paper used? How do people cite this paper? And this is a paper by an epidemiologist, Ken Rothman, and he writes, no adjustments are needed for multiple comparisons in the title. Cited 4,500 times, a little bit more. We love these recommendations, right? We really like this kind of stuff. If you read the paper and if you look at how people actually use it, there are some decent recommendations in the paper, which are, among other things, you don't need multiple comparisons. You don't need adjustments for multiple comparisons, because you shouldn't make claims. You shouldn't make yes or no claims at all. And if you make no claims, you can make no errors. And if you can make no errors, you can also just let this go, multiple comparison corrections. But of course, people who cite this are still making claims. They're just not correcting for multiple comparisons anymore, because this title gives them a good reason not to. So we are in this habit of taking very simplistic advice and finding it sufficient. That's our mode of working for many things, because if you really want to dig into this, that requires a lot of work. But let's try, let's try this. Let's follow this recommendation by Green and say, what would we actually need to do a good job? So we should do a power analysis according to this researcher. So if we do a power analysis, we need a couple of things. First, we need to set some alpha level. Then we have a desired level of power, and then we need to fill in an effect size. Those are the things that go into a power analysis. Let's start with the easy things and slowly work our way up to the more difficult things that we need to establish here. So we start with our alpha level, and then an easy question, first question is, we know that the alpha level we're filling in is 5%, right? I mean, of course, we know that this is the case. Why is this actually the case? The main lesson here is not really why we are using 5%. I mean, the main lesson, I hope, is that you think I don't think I actually know why we are using 5%. And maybe you do, that would be great if you know it. But I think many people have no idea why exactly they're using this thing. We use it not because we understand the underlying reasons, but because through repetition, this has become very familiar. And we think, yeah, this is the way we work. Now, of course, one reason that we're using a 5% alpha is because Moses put it, came down off Mount Sinai and he said, look, this is one of the 10 commandments. Number 6 was, thou shalt use an alpha of 5%. No, actually not. Let's again go back into history and actually read the papers that these recommendations are based on. I know, again, we're not supposed to do this, but this is a particularly nice read. This is a paper by Neyman and Pearson. This is the starting point of the type of hypothesis testing that we use in psychology, where we control error rates, where we reject the null hypothesis if our p-value is smaller than an alpha level, where we do power analysis to control the type 2 error rates. That's what they came up with. So let's take a look at how they thought we should be using this. They write, but whatever conclusion is reached, the following position must be recognized. If we reject the null hypothesis, we may reject it when it is true. If we accept the null hypothesis, we may be accepting it when it is false. That is to say, when really some alternative hypothesis is true. So they are describing here type 1 errors and type 2 errors. They say these two sources of errors can rarely be eliminated completely. In some cases, it will be more important to avoid the first. In others, the second. Interesting, right? So they're not saying one is more important than the other. Say it depends. And then they explain that this is sort of like deciding on whether you're going to send a prisoner to jail or not. So what are the choices there? Well, it depends on what is the punishment. Is the punishment a death sentence? Then we should be pretty sure that this person is guilty. What are the consequences if we send this person back into society? We don't put them in jail. What's the probability that they'll repeat whatever crime they have committed? So these are the decisions we need to make. And then they do something which is incredibly rare for statisticians. They acknowledge that it's not up to them to tell us what to do. I mean, that's just amazing. It's very rare. But you see, these are great researchers. So they write in the end, the use of these statistical tools in any given case in determining just how the balance should be struck must be left to the investigator. So that's us. We need to make these decisions, case basis. Now, if you have a really nice idea, a really groundbreaking idea, which, I don't know, it's Nobel Prize time. Huh? I mean, you want to go for this Nobel Prize for economics that we can just get, because they don't give us our own one. Okay, so you do some economics research. This is your Nobel Prize winning idea, right, that you're after. In this case, if this is really your best idea that you're going to have in your life, how bad is it if it's a type 1 error? You'll probably build on it and try to replicate it. You'll find out that it's maybe a fluke. But what happens if you miss it? So if you have a type 2 error, if you have a really good idea, but you give up on this Nobel Prize winning research line because it was a type 2 error, because you set your type 2 error rate really high. So these are decisions that you need to make on a case-by-case basis. I mean, I really don't have to worry about my alpha level, to be honest, because all my hypotheses are correct. My nulls are never true. I just always have great research ideas. So, in my case, who cares about the alpha level? I mean, I'm joking, but this is a thing that you can take into account when you set your alpha level. If you're pretty sure that the effect is there, why worry about a type 1 error? You're not going to make one. All right, so this is the alpha level part. We ignore recommendations to actually think about it, and we just follow a heuristic. Fine. Second question in our power analysis is, what is our type 2 error rate? And here we also know the answer. Why are we using a statistical power of at least 80%? I mean, this is what we have to use, right? Everybody knows. Have to have 80% power. Maybe you think that's actually a little bit low, but okay, we'll come to that in a second. But let's just take a look at why most people in our field aim for 80% power. What's the reason behind this? We again go in the literature and reread this. In this case, it's also Jacob Gohan who recommends this. So he writes, it is proposed here as a convention that when the investigator has no other basis for setting the desired power value, the value of 80% is used. So if you can't think of anything else, then use this. This means that beta is set at 20%. We have a 20% type 2 error rate. This arbitrary but reasonable value is offered for several reasons. Gohan, 1965. There are no reasons in Gohan 1965. Trust me, I read it. Doesn't say anything important. The chief among them takes into consideration the implicit convention of an alpha level of 5%. We are building a convention upon a convention. And then Gohan has determined for all of us that the relative seriousness of these two kinds of errors, a type 1 and a type 2 error, is in the order of 20% to 5%. Or in other words, type 1 errors are of the order of 4 times as serious as type 2 errors. That's the reason. We have the implicit convention that our alpha is always 5%. And Gohan thinks that for your research and for all research done from the past in the future, it's 4 times as bad to make a type 1 error as a type 2 error. Now, you might agree, accidentally, this is spot on. This happens to be what you think, but it's also possible that this is not what you think. You know, maybe that's not true. There's actually a very good argument to be made that you probably don't have very good reasons to think a type 1 error is much worse than a type 2 error. At least if we work in a literature where we nicely report all our findings and we do a replication every now and then so we catch a type 1 error. In that case, it might be perfectly fine that you actually want balanced error rates. Yeah, it's a very reasonable thing. It would make all of this a lot easier to teach to people as well. It has a lot of nice properties if we would aim for 95% power. Might be a little bit too much detail to explain why this is the case, but if we have 95% power, you can think that if you don't find the effect that you powered your study for, there's only a 5% probability that it's actually there. In essence, you are performing an equivalence test, a test against the absence of an effect at a 5% alpha level for the equivalence test, because the type 2 error rate for a null hypothesis test is actually flipped around as the alpha level for an equivalence test. Now, if this sounds a bit too much detail because you don't really know what these equivalence tests are about, that's fine. But if you know what they're about, there are very nice properties of balancing error rates. Just, I mean, take a look at this. I want to say trust me, but that's exactly against my whole talk here. I'm happy to send some references your way if you care about this. So, sorry. So this is the second part, right? We have our alpha level, we have our type 2 error rate. Now let's get to the tricky part. What is the effect size that you want to use in your power analysis? So what do we do here? Well, if we think about this question, it's actually really difficult because we don't really know which effect size to expect. This is always the point where people don't really want to do a power analysis anymore because they start to fill in numbers and then they get very large sample sizes and they don't like the sample size. They think, oh, actually I expect a little bit of a larger effect size, and they keep going back and forth, and it becomes a pretty meaningless exercise. Now, there's one thing you shouldn't do, which many people actually do, and that is you should not use an effect size based on other effects in the published literature. That seems like it's a pretty good idea. You know, you look at things in the literature, you're like, hey, yeah, this would be nice. Regrettably, we have wasted the possibility that this is a good approach. The reason that we have messed this up for ourselves is because you, well, and I, let's be honest, we publish only significant results. We know this. We recently did a study published earlier this year where we looked at the published literature. 96% of studies yield significant results. They find the predicted effect. As some people in the past have joked, this is almost so good that it should convince us that we have precognition, if this is really what's going on. We don't need to collect the data anymore. Really, if we have a 96% accuracy rate in our hypothesis, let's just skip the data collection because apparently everything magically works out. Of course, it doesn't make any sense. The fact that we all publish significant results selectively is a very peculiar thing as well. If you've read the Code of Conduct of Research Integrity, I don't know if you have one. We have a European one. We have a Dutch one. We have a couple of versions. All of them say that we're not supposed to do this. In the Dutch one, it says you should treat a null effect the same way as you treat a significant effect. There's no distinction you should make between these two. Of course, given that you designed a good study and all that, that's an important part. But if you would accept an effect if it was there, you should also accept a null effect. The reason for this is, if nothing else, that if you designed your study with 80% power, there's a 20% probability that you'll find no significant effect. That's pretty high. There are about 70 people in this session. So that means that, I don't know, I mean, I can't really do math very well, but let's say 14 of you should find a non-significant result in your next study, even if you're right about your hypothesis, because you aimed for 80%. So these 14 people should publish their null results. If you don't do it, you're inflating your effect sizes. So this gets into a messy business. If you look at this behavior that we do, it is really quite peculiar, publishing significant results and not the rest. Now, you might think that there are good reasons, and I'm happy to discuss these with you. But if we ask what the general public thinks of this practice, we see that they think it is immoral behavior. So this is a study by Pickett and Roche. They ask about two scenarios. One is where a researcher falsifies and fabricates data. That's the numbers on the left. Of course, everybody thinks this is hugely problematic. You shouldn't be doing this. But I would recommend you to go to your grocer tomorrow. And then you buy some groceries, and the person behind the cash register, you say, let me ask you a question. There's a scientist, and this scientist performs research, but they only share the results of their research if it supported what they hope to find. And if that's not the case, they don't share it with their colleagues. What do you think of this? And that's exactly what this study did. So the selective reporting is this scenario. Then you see that 71% of people thinks that this is morally unacceptable. There's more fun. If we look at the second item, they ask, do you think that people who do this should be fired? Then 63% of the general public thinks that sounds like a good idea. Because I don't know a lot about science, but this sounds like it would be really problematic behavior for scientists. So I think we should fire scientists who do this. Now, this sounds really extreme in our eyes. I mean, if we look at this, you think that's crazy. We couldn't do this. But that is because we live in a science where the norms are that this is totally appropriate behavior. But things change. Norms like these change. I mean, imagine that somebody you get into the elevator with lights a cigarette in your building. How would you respond to this? You'd think that that's absolutely crazy behavior. You might even think it is unethical, or it's at least harmful behavior. You shouldn't be doing this. But of course, 30, 40 years ago, this was completely normal behavior, and many people did this. So norms change, and I am more than happy to bet that 50 years from now, our practice of only publishing results that are statistically significant will be seen as something that was completely normative, but it was wrong. I don't think this will stand the test of time. All right, so what should we do then? Well, we should calculate the power that we want for not the effect size that we see in the literature, because those are not reliable. We should use the smallest effect size that we actually care about. This is a trick that people in medicine also do. It makes it so that your studies are informative, both if you find an effect and if you don't find an effect. If you power for an effect you hope to observe, the result will be informative if you're right about your hopes. But if your hopes were too optimistic, what do you learn? You learn that your hopes were incorrect. That doesn't help us. What we want to do is say, what's the smallest thing where you're really like, okay, let's call it a day. This is too small to matter. For example, if you've gotten your vaccine shot, the study that was designed to test whether the vaccine was effective had a smallest effect size of interest. It should have a certain efficacy. And if it didn't meet this target, then they're saying, look, we're not going to use this vaccine. There were a couple of vaccines that were tested that didn't meet this criteria. The ones that you got were effective enough. They were large enough to actually matter according to these thresholds. So this is what happens in other fields, but it takes a lot of it's very challenging to think about what the smallest effect size is. There is, I think, a reason that we don't really do this. And that is because you get into, well, there are two options. So first, you can compute the smallest effect size of interest if your research has really applied consequences. You do some sort of intervention, a decision is made, it will be done in practice, yes or no. If this is the case, good for you. You can do a cost-benefit analysis and determine the smallest effect size of interest. Another situation is where your theories make predictions that are so accurate. You build some computational model and you have a lower bound of some parameters. So theoretically, you can predict the smallest effect size of interest. That's all great. But in most cases, we don't have these practical applications. We don't have these computational models. And then we will need to start to talk to each other about, okay, so which effects actually matter? And do our effects matter? Or are our effects too small to matter? And this very quickly becomes slightly uncomfortable because there should be cases probably where we say, this, what I'm doing, what I'm working on is actually too small to matter. I mean, matter, this is all values, right? So there's no right or wrong answer, but there should at least theoretically be some effects that are too small to matter that we're still studying. But that would be very peculiar if we start to have a real conversation about this, because it would mean that some people need to give up their research lines because they're too small to matter. I'm not sure if we're ready for a discussion like this. All right. Now, okay, this is all the stuff we were working on and doing, but now we don't need to worry about all these past heuristics, right? These are the old ones. We're going through a new time where we're rethinking about how we work, and things are really improving, right? Well, let's say yes first, because I don't want to be too negative about this. Yes, there is a lot of room for improvement. Things are going right. But there's also still a lot of reliance on all sorts of heuristics that are just different heuristics. So people love to complain to me about what's going on. Or sometimes they ask me like, hey, what happened here? Am I crazy or is this unfair? So I just want to share one case that has to do with sample size justification. Somebody submitted a paper to JPSP. They got a desk rejection and the editor says, you know, nowadays you need 250 participants for this kind of study. So you have a too small a sample size, so this is desk rejected. You know, people realize we need larger samples, which is great. But this is just another heuristic. Let's take a look at where this heuristic comes from, because it's quite recent. There's a paper, a very good paper that I recommend reading by Felix Schoenbrod and Marco Perugini from 2013, where they present a lot of effect sizes and sample sizes relating to correlations. And they say, look, here's a lot of information, but I guess a reviewer said, you know, this is a big table. Can you just give them some sort of take home message or something? You know, you can just see this happen during the review process. And then they write, yeah, well, okay, let's give a summary. If table one should be boiled down to simple answers, for typical research scenarios, reasonable trade-offs between accuracy and confidence start to be achieved when N approaches 250. So there we have this number. Okay, now let's take a look at table one. So table one has sample sizes depending on the accuracy you want, which is the W, which is the width of a confidence interval, 10, 15, 20. It has a point of stability, which is another part in their simulation, like when do things sort of stay close enough within a certain range so that your effect size is accurate. That can be an 80% probability or 90 or 95. So a combination of these two leads to estimates depending on the true effect size of the sample size that you'd need, ranging from 20, which is the lowest, all the way up to 470. That regrettably is the complexity of really having a sample size that is informed, not just a heuristic. Yes, you can summarize this table as saying, you know, 250 more or less, but it's very well possible that the researchers who submitted this paper knew what they were getting into. They knew they had quite a large sample size. They didn't need a huge or quite a large effect size. They didn't need a huge sample size. So the real answer should be, or the real summary should be, if table one should be boiled down to simple answers, then the simple answer is it depends, which is of course the most horrible question, like the most horrible answer that we get if we ask other people for advice. What should we do? It depends. It is a correct answer, but nobody wants to hear this answer. Now, it depends, but it doesn't depend on crazy things. It depends on a couple of things that we can actually learn to understand. It depends on the effect size, which we might want to learn a little bit about, more or less, before we run our big study. It depends on the desired accuracy, which is something that you can decide upon, and the desired confidence that you want in this specific approach to sample size justification. And both of these things are something you can discuss among your collaborators or people in the field. So you can learn to make informed judgments about this. It doesn't take a crazy amount of time. And I think especially if you're in a position where you can desk reject papers of other people, it's worth taking a look at this or asking somebody else what this works like. Now, there are a couple of other important topics I think we don't discuss enough because they touch upon these norms. Again, my whole theme here is sample size justification. I could do many other things, and hopefully you can generalize some of these comments to things that are maybe more relevant in your field, other topics where this also applies. But we also have norms that prevent us from discussing things that are pretty important. I think it's almost like certain things become taboo topics. We're not supposed to say them. And one of the things that I noticed is that we never honestly say that our sample sizes are constrained by the resources we have. You never read this. People also always say something like, yeah, we did a power analysis because that's the thing we're supposed to do. And magically it all worked out. It was fine. Nobody ever says the PhD student working on this project had 4 months left, and therefore data collection was limited to what we could do in 2 months, which is the reality, right? Or nobody says, I didn't get this nice grant that I applied for, so my resources were $700, and that basically means I could pay participant money for this number, and that is what you see here. Now, I am willing to bet that even if you're able to do a power analysis, resource constraints are always an issue in the back of your mind, because otherwise, why wouldn't you aim for 99.9% power? And why wouldn't you set your alpha level to 0.00001? Yes, you would need a huge sample size, but you also have the most convincing, accurate study there. I mean, right? We don't do this. We don't have the resources for this. But if you look at papers, how often do you see this issue discussed? Almost never, I think. So when I see these things, I again think that's interesting, right? This is apparently a norm in our field. We're not supposed to say honestly that we have resource constraints, but we have them, right? I find that so peculiar. There's a difference between the reality as we know it exists and what we write about in our papers. One thing I hope we can do is just be a little bit more honest about things. So I wrote a paper about sample size justification. I mentioned it earlier, where I point this out that this is a thing you can do. You can just honestly say that your sample size was constrained by resource limitations. It's one of possible sample size justifications. There are a whole bunch of other ones, but sometimes this is just what it is. So when I discuss this, I say, oh, sorry, I clicked on the next slide. So I say that if you have this situation where resource limitations are an issue, and that is often the case, there are two things I think are interesting. First of all, it should sometimes be the case that you decide when you plan the study that given limited resources, it's not worth to collect the data. Sometimes it's not valuable enough, your data. It's not going to be interesting enough. The second thing is that if you do this, you should probably have some good reasons why data collection is still informative. So these are the recommendations in the paper, right? Sometimes you can do this, and this is this table 3. So there are a couple of things that I could come up with that could say, look, I have limited resources, but this is worth collecting because of some good reasons. For example, I think somebody will publish a meta-analysis in the future, and this is input for it. I'm not going to overinterpret my p-values here because I don't have good error control, but this is basically something for the future, or, well, any other range of things that you can take a look at. So then if you look at how people use this, which is, I think, a benefit of putting a preprint online, right? I mean, I know I should return those revisions, but people already use these recommendations. Reviewers had no problems with these recommendations. It's okay. So, well, one thing reviewers always note when I say these things that are honest, right? when I try to convince people to write things down that are more honest, they say, look, people are going to misuse this kind of honest advice. They're going to misuse it and say, oh, yeah, we had resource limitations because I collected data for 1 week and then I wanted to go on a 4-week holiday. So yeah, we don't have a lot of data or something like this. I don't think don't know what they think, but they think that there's always some room for abuse. And this is true, of course. You give people more options to justify a sample size and they can get away with this. Okay, so let's take a look at what people do. And sometimes the reviewers who are skeptical are right. Sometimes people just want an excuse. They just want to cite a thing. It is a citation in their paper, and they can get away with this small sample size because of feasibility constraints. So this is an example of a paper that tries to use my paper to get away with a bad justification for a small sample size. They write, we decided upon 22 participants as we were aware of our recruitment abilities and resources. 43, that's me, that's my citation. Nevertheless, this sample size is common in exercise science studies in which discoveries of null effects often occur. Yeah, I understand. That's often what happens. You have too small sample size. So this is exactly the wrong thing. But hey, there is a citation there. They got it past the reviewers. Good for them. So this makes me a little bit sad. But I look through a lot of these citations to keep track of how big the problem is. And it's actually not that bad. And sometimes I see things that make me a little bit happy because they get us closer to the truth. So this is another paper that also cites this idea of feasibility constraints, which exist, but it does so in a pretty good way. They say our sample size was determined by time, funding, and the difficulty of running participants through an in-lab study one at a time. I mean, isn't that refreshing? I think that's refreshing. You read this, it's true. This is like the truth. This is their real reason for their sample size justification. And then they say, however, because research investigating sexual arousal's impact on the willingness to engage in an extensive list of sexual behaviors for men and women is lacking, so there's not a lot of knowledge about this, the results of this study provide insights into the size of these effects. At least it's something, it's a starting point. And they also say, we urge readers to interpret the p-values reported in the study with caution, to instead focus on each test's effect size, which will inform future research. Nice, nuanced, I think, point, right? I mean, maybe you don't like it, let me know. I mean, I can warn for things that you don't like about this in the revision, but I like this. It's honest. We moved away from the norm that we don't discuss feasibility constraints. We honestly say that we have them. Good. So the main point that I think I want to make here is that we really have to be careful that as we are trying to improve the way that we work, we don't switch from old heuristics that didn't make a lot of sense to new heuristics that also don't make a lot of sense. There are many cases where people make honest attempts to improve things, but there's also a big risk that there are a lot of heuristics that just pop up and people believe. I mean, I'm more than happy to spend 30 minutes in the discussing the heuristic that Bayesian statistics for some magical reason is better than the use of p-values. I mean, it's my favorite thing, I mean, I love to discuss about this, but this is also, there's no empirical evidence for this. And actually the empirical evidence that recently emerged about how people use Bayes vectors should make us very, very careful about the huge number of mistakes that are in papers. Not surprisingly, people are not trained in this. So it's not, a problem inherent to these Bayes vectors. It's just not a magical solution, even though it's sometimes presented like this. But you see that there's sort of things that people think we should be doing now, but not for a very good reason or underlying argument. The main thing, if we want to fix this issue of this reliance on heuristics, is a very deep one, a very difficult one, I think. If you really want to prevent researchers from just going into the literature, taking a look at the first citation that makes them get away with a problematic behavior, then we need to make sure that the research they do is not just something that they want to publish, but is research that is really worth doing well. So this is the main thing we should focus on, not teaching things to change things around or do this new thing or get this new whatever. We should make sure that people do research that is worth doing well, that they care deeply about. It might also mean that you can't do this work by yourself, that you need to team up because doing science is really difficult, right? So it typically requires collective discussions about what we value, what we think is important to do well. We probably need larger teams of people, team science, to do these kind of studies. Maybe not in all fields, right? Maybe you're perfectly set to do this yourself. But in other cases, it will require certain consensus-making procedures, like, okay, this is the best way to do this. Now let's get this done collectively. Again, I'm not saying that everything should follow this procedure. There are many fields where you can get away with doing things in your lab by yourself. But think about it like physics, for example. In physics, there are fields where they realize that they need to do research together with people who have expertise in specific things. They create these huge teams, like at CERN, for example. Everybody plays their little part. They make a perfect study. Now, not all physicists have to work in this team. There are a lot of people who can do studies by themselves in their office, letting some plasma drip and having a high resolution camera, and they record it, and they can do perfect research by themselves in their room. No need to do team science. But for many of the things we find interesting in psychology, this is probably the direction we need to go in if we think it is worth doing well. It also means that we should put science first. This is a quote that somebody told me who works for AstraZeneca, company you now probably know because they do a pretty good job making vaccines. They have this as their motto: put science first. And when I heard this, I thought, that's interesting for a company, pharmaceutical company, to have this. I wonder if we actually do this as scientists, where we put science first, instead of things that are more interesting for ourselves, right? Getting this paper out is much easier than putting science first and doing a really good job with something that's valuable. I want to end with this quote, which is by Bacon from 1820, which is probably far too idealistic for most people, but it is so interesting. I mean, it's such a nice look at how we should be doing science, according to Bacon in 1620. So he writes here, lastly, I would address one general admonition to all, that they consider what are the true ends of knowledge, and that they seek it not either for pleasure of the mind or for contention or for superiority to others or for profit or for fame or power or any of these inferior things, but for the benefit and use of life, and that they perfect and govern it in charity. This is pretty noble aims, right? It means that when you do your next study, you should not find it fun. That's not a reason to do good study. It shouldn't do because you hope to become famous, or that you make money, or that other people are impressed by what you do. But you should do all of this for basically the good of others, right? For the benefit of society. Do something that's worthwhile. But if you are serious about this viewpoint, then it follows that you can't follow these simplistic heuristics, right? You can't just do a just good enough job that convinces some reviewers, but you really need to sit down and think, okay, how should we really do good science that goes beyond simple heuristics, and that is worth doing. Okay, that's what I wanted to say. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Daniel. Yeah, again, everyone feel free to either type in a question in the chat or just type in your name, and I'll kind of monitor it, and we'll either read the question out loud or just call on the person. So it looks like we have a question from Steve Lindsay. Interested to hear your views on the recent Woes et al. Multi-lab test of ego depletion, and was that well done?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a great example of how to do science. I love it. I love the paper. One thing that's really impressive is that the people who were involved in the original research that other people failed to replicate, which is what often happens, that they said, okay, let's take a really good look at how this works, and we commit ourselves to figuring out if we can find this or not. And that, I think, is exactly the right attitude, right? Now, I know we can debate a little bit about whether the final effect sizes that are reported in the paper, where there's this specific way of analyzing it, makes it a Cohen's d of 0.008, which is just significant for 0.06. Yes, of course, these people have a little bit of confirmation bias. They really, really want this to be true. That makes a lot of sense. But we shouldn't focus so much on that part, but on the fact that they committed to doing this research, that they joined this project. I think that's extremely impressive. So yeah, I think this is a great example of how to do good science, I think.
All right, next we have Darko.
Thanks, Jason. Daniel, thanks a lot for a really awesome talk. I'm going to push a little bit on something that I'd love to hear you say more about. So, I'm listening to everything that you're saying, and I'm finding very little to disagree about in the concrete. But it also sounds to me like a lot of what you talked about today are symptoms, right? Symptoms of a broader, bigger problem. And I was surprised maybe to that you didn't really talk about, what underlies, what's the root cause of a lot of this? It seems to be you were pointing at times maybe at our norms. Well, okay, but norms are themselves a byproduct of something else, right?
Mm-hmm.
You were pointing at sometimes maybe a little bit at us as individuals, right? Being like, well, you need to make sure that, you're not using heuristics, et cetera. And great, yes, but it seems to me that, both in the replication crisis and in a lot of this, there's clearly a bigger, more systemic problem here that has led us and other scientists as well into the situations we've been facing. And I wonder to what extent some of the advice that you have for all of us should really be about things like don't use heuristics, as opposed to evaluating what's the true, set of root causes here and trying to collectively address those. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that side of things.
So I think that this is a starting point of solving some of these underlying problems, right? So, I could also say, look, it would be nice if you just all stop publishing, right? People, especially people who have tenure, love to say that we should just all publish less because, then we have more time to do good research. And of course, I already have tenure. So it's basically you should all publish less and it should just magically work out. That's a bit of a difficult thing. One of the things that are important when you think about doing good science that doesn't just mindlessly follow norms that gets you past this publication threshold, but that is actually doing valuable work, right? A good study, is that, first of all, you can do it, right? You can manage to do a good study. And as a reviewer, you can hold this bar up to other people as well, right? You can not let them get away with these kind of minor things. So it's much more feasible thing to do. Now, you're right that there is a bigger issue at play where we can talk about the reward structures or the individual nature of science. So I think this is the part where I say that the solution is consensus building and team science. And let me explain briefly why, right? So the reason that we are doing such a sometimes just satisficing kind of approach to doing research, right? We just follow norms. We don't really learn about things, is that we don't have the time to learn everything about the things that we're actually doing. The problem is that we have a system where you are supposed to know everything about statistics and you have to become a psychometrician and a theorist and an experimenter and a great writer and then teacher and a manager and all these things. We're putting people in a position where it's actually impossible for you to do a very good job at these things because you just don't have the time to learn enough about all the issues that you should think about. In medicine, that's why they introduce specialization. They think this is important enough to do well. And if you have a statistician for a big randomized controlled trial in medicine, and you ask them to justify their choice for an alpha level, you'll get a decent answer. Maybe that it's just recommended by or required by law, for example, to have certain thresholds. But there is enough room for people to become experts and have well-justified opinions. For us, this is not really an issue. So I think that is actually part of the system that's pretty problematic. Maybe you're hinting more in the direction of pressures to publish and those kind of things, right? Which is also true.
I think I really appreciate the answer and yeah, both of those, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's also true, but I think there's actually a much, even deeper issue. So the pressure to publish is one thing, of course, but even if we reduce that a little bit, we haven't solved the fact that you don't have enough time to think about everything and do a really good job. So that is, for me, there are multiple problems. We can address many of them, but I think these pressures, many people talk about them. It's perfectly fine, right? I mean, those are real issues, publication pressure and those kind of things. But I think even then, we will be left with a system where we just don't have enough time to become experts in all these things. We will continue to follow norms. Many of them are completely inappropriate. Yeah, so it's a different issue, I think, but the issues you raise are just, also very important. But I think this part is less discussed, I think.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Right, next we have Kalina.
I wanted to follow up on exactly that point. So thanks for setting this up really well, Darko, and thanks, Daniel, for a really interesting talk. I enjoyed it immensely. So my question was very similar, in fact, but I want to bring in something just in a little bit more, with a little bit more sharpness here. And that has to do with, I kept thinking throughout your talk, Daniel, that basically you're raising the need, the necessity for us as scientists to, in Danny Kahneman's terms, engage less of system 1 and more of system 2. So less heuristics, more rational reasoning, for lack of a better term, but more executive functions, and less pure heuristics, basically. So it strikes me that, and this is, I think, one of the pitfalls that we as scientists often fall into. We don't like to admit that we're actually just like the people we study, and that some of the things that we know could work on other people should work on us as scientists as well. So we do know actually what helps people engage in less heuristics and do more of the deeper thinking. What it is less stress, less emotional pressures, right? And more time. So you already came up with the whole notion of time. Yes, we're pressed for time. The more junior we are, the more pressed we are. And we're pressed to publish numbers, not just quality, right? So I just go back to this simple notion of why don't we just take the research that we have ourselves, especially our colleagues in JDM, performed. And so we know actually how to reduce the pressure to engage in heuristics. And so why don't we actually have that discussion about science and how to alter our practices based on our own research findings, in order to actually open up the space to then engage in value-based discussions, which are really hard if everyone's just feeling pressured, right? Yeah. And so you can't engage in that discussion about value if people are the heuristics level of analysis. You need to calm down all the sources of stress that everyone is experiencing and open space for them to engage in that. But that involves assuring them that if they don't publish these 20 papers this year that they were told they must, they will still survive professionally, right? So I just want to bring that up and point out my belief that it's actually a precondition for what you're arguing needs to happen. Yeah,
I think it's a very good point. I can only add a little bit of another way in which we might slow down. So I think your suggestions are great. Another way in which fields in general slow down, if there are real big problems that emerge. And it's actually, and some fields have this. So they encounter problems. I mean, you would think we've had these problems in psychology, but apparently not to the extent that we really, really slowed down and stopped to work on things. So in genomics, this happened a bit more. They also had huge problems in replicability, but they really had to change the way that the field works. And we haven't done this step yet. We haven't really changed the way that our field works. And it's interesting because for some reason, it seems that the feedback mechanism, like we don't really create huge accidents in some way, or at least not very visible accidents, right? The inefficiencies or the things that go wrong are not really visible in the way we work, which is maybe in part because we hide away part of the research that doesn't work out. But it would also be good if the way that we work has more direct feedback on our process. If there's some sort of target, like not a target, maybe that's not a good way, but that we see that the things we're doing are sort of failing or not efficient enough. But there's almost none of that feedback that forces us to reconsider our way of working, right? People sometimes say, like, if we would build bridges, they would collapse, or if we would build airplanes, they would crash down. And then we would say, okay, we need to stop, slow down, make sure that we're doing this in a better way. But those things don't really happen. I mean, we have certain issues, but they're never big enough to force us to slow down. Yeah, so maybe you're right. I mean, we should just use slightly more subtle strategies to force people to think and rely less on heuristics. I think it's definitely worthwhile to think about.
Right, so I put my name as well. So yeah, thank you, very interesting talk. I had a question, it relates to some of the other things that have been brought up already, but kind of curious about specifically the training aspect. So like, for instance, training grad students, coursework and such. And I think a common critique is like, you know, if you ask a researcher kind of why they made these choices for their analysis, they might say, well, that's what I learned in my stat class. And then you ask the stat teacher, it's like, well, why'd you teach it that way? Say like, well, that's because what researchers do. And so it's just like this weird, you know, cyclical thing. And I guess I think I've also heard it argued that there's some utility in having at least some kind of like, you know, whether it's a benchmark or just sort of like raw numbers they can plug in just for while they learn and just can kind of like go through the motions. And then with the idea that they can then think past that at some point, but there's also the flip side of that, that maybe they don't kind of move past that and just stick kind of ingrained in those norms. So I guess just wondering your broad thoughts on, for one, I guess the extent to which, you know, say graduate training might perpetuate these sorts of things, and, you know, kind of selfishly maybe looking for advice if you have any like thoughts on like ways we can, you know, maybe improve this situation.
Yeah, so I completely agree, and I have this in many papers. So when, for example, you can say that people should justify their alpha level, but when I teach, it is extremely confusing if I start to use different alpha levels just for the sake of illustrating that you can have different alpha levels. You know, it makes it actually slightly more confusing for students, especially if you talk about certain topics where alpha levels are reduced to control for multiple comparisons or sequential analysis or those things. So then you say something like, okay, I'm going to use a 5% alpha level, but it's something you should also consider maybe changing. I actually think moving away from the 80% power is much more important in this sense, but okay. So that's a problem. But everybody who proposes benchmarks only lives to regret them. So everybody, I mean, this is, Gohan later said, yeah, I regretted of doing this kind of thing. And I can point to other people who've proposed other benchmarks for things, and they all ended up regretting them. So it's just a system that doesn't work. Like there is no pushing back against people abusing these kind of benchmarks, apparently. Ways of resolving this, it's not easy to do. I mean, this requires a lot of stuff. That's why we have been stuck in these ways of working for a very long time. So if you want to move beyond this, you need dedicated people who look into these questions and work on them. It's not going to be a simple solution because a lot of these questions are value-based, right? They're like, how important is it to make an error? I mean, and this is just statistics, right? The argument goes well beyond this. The broader argument is, what do we value, right? How important are certain things that we want to find? So the only way to do this is to get people who are specialized and have the expertise to work on this, to work on those kind of issues. And that is, again, what we see in other fields. And it is very good to look at what other fields do. If you want to get rid of your norms or feel slightly weird about the norms you all of a sudden seem to have, you just look at another field and you recognize that there are other ways of working. So a bit more of contact with other fields might help already in moving us along and inviting those people to help us out if they managed to fix some of these issues. This issue of smallest effect size of interest, for example, in medical fields has been a field of study for decades. They know how much pain reduction is an important and worthwhile reduction in pain. And pain is also a difficult thing to measure. So we can use their techniques and apply them in our own fields, for example.
Great, thank you. And next we have Lauren.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Yeah. Great. Daniel, thank you for this colloquium. I honestly felt like giving you a standing ovation at several times. You couldn't see me, so that would have been kind of pointless. Thanks. But just, I think I, reflect a lot of people saying this was a really incredible and very eye-opening and very informative. And I would say also, I agree with everything that you said. I want to kind of like, I don't know, get your thoughts / possibly pushback on the idea that physics has it right or the medical field has it right. I think that your take homes and your lessons from those fields, I think, are absolutely, I agree with you. From my experience, so my work does sort of at times straddle into sort of biomedical research. I have a little bit of training in biomedical research. From where I did my PhD, I was able, or did postdoc, I was able to do a bit of that. And my experience with researchers in that field is their stats brain is off. They say, I'm not someone who's an expert in that. When I want to know how many people, I just ask this other person. I don't do analyses. And I felt like that style of research really was very much what I did not want to do. So the idea that we would simply like have a stats expert who is going to be the one who's going to give us the answers to these questions, as I see so commonly happen in that field, is something that I don't think I agree with. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on that. And if you felt like also see that danger as well, how would you think we could kind of pursue this path, recognizing that as a PI, I can't be as stat savvy as I want to be given all the other pressures. How could we avoid this?
Yeah, that's a very good point, because it's not so easy. Now, in practice, I think in fields like medicine, and maybe there are cases where really one person doesn't understand why the numbers came out as they came out. But in practice, they do often have to come out of a dialogue between the statistician and the researcher. So the researcher might not completely understand how they came up with those numbers, because that's the statsy part, but actually the statistician can also not figure out what the inputs are and compute anything without the dialogue. So there is something going on in between those two people that translates a research question into some sort of meaningful model that can be put into a sample size justification. In the extreme that you describe, it's pretty problematic, I think. And there are definitely fields, and this is a very interesting question. And this is actually, you're right, in physics, this happens. Like there's complete lack of knowledge about what somebody else has done, but they incorporate this thing in their research anyway. I mean, I just see that Duigu Ugen is in this call. And I mean, that's somebody who studies how it's possible in such a distributed system to have knowledge generation that we can still rely on, right? Which is actually amazing. And it's not very easy or obvious how that works. So yes, there are also risks in this specialization and challenges. I think hopefully it's not that black and white, but the first thing is that there is a pretty clear improvement. So there is problems with those things, but I'm not completely sure. Well, it's a value judgment maybe, but I think at least we're getting certain things right. And then there are other things that we should solve. Yeah. But there's always something like that.
I agree with you. I will just say that in so maybe this was a school specific thing. I literally never encountered a researcher who really had much of, from my perspective, enough understanding of the stats side of things. So it could have been school specific, and that's good to hear that at least maybe there was more dialogue, but
ideally, ideally, I'm sure that there are issues on the other side where people just, where it doesn't work. I don't know enough about it to say what the issues are. So, but I understand there are risks on the other side, of course. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right. Next, we have a question from Daniel Ganama that has been typed in, and I'll read out loud. First says, sorry for the wall of text. My Wi-Fi is dreadful for upload. Then thank you, Dr. Lakens and the UBC Psych Department for this. Would one way of remedying this issue be conducting pre-planned studies for meta-analyses? Not sure if this is already a thing. I'm guessing there's a lot of logistical difficulties. And maybe this is a naive question, but perhaps scientists' own practical limitations of their studies, e.g. smaller sample sizes, wouldn't matter much if there was a coordinated effort to produce a lot of research/data through a pre-planned collaboration and replication effort. Since the researchers would know in 10 years or in 15 years, much of this data would be aggregated in some way. A Bryant Nosek et al. Reproducibility project kind of thing, but from the start.
Yeah. So so it does exist, what is described here. It's called a prospective meta-analysis. So this is a meta-analysis where you plan ahead and you say, look, the bunch of us, and actually the Vols et al. Study that Steve mentioned is one of those, right? We plan that all these people are going to do studies. In this case, even one thing I didn't mention that's very exciting, slightly different versions of a study. Well, we'll group them all together and analyze them in a meta-analysis somewhere in the future. So this is called a prospective meta-analysis, and you can do this. Now, let's take this and level it up a couple of times. And one way in which I like to do this is ask, imagine that you will be a benevolent manager of 100 people who work in your research field, and they will, sorry, yeah, this is the warning in my building that I have to get out in 15 minutes. But so imagine that you are a good manager for 100 people in your field for the next decade. Take a moment to think about what this group of people that you can now sort of suggest studies to and coordinate things with, what will they get done? And I think that if you think about this, that sounds pretty nice, because all of a sudden there's a 10-year coherent research project where a lot of people who are experts work towards some sort of goal, right? So this is what you get with coordination and a little bit of consensus. We don't do this. So now take a moment and think, what are you actually going to do in the next 10 years? And what will you and all your colleagues have done after 10 years? So if I think about this, the first version sounds really attractive, where we have this coordination, we work towards certain things, and 10 years from now, we have, I feel, really probably gotten some stuff figured out collectively. But it's very unlikely that this current way of working, where I just think, oh yeah, this is good, and let's do this. Yeah, I don't have the resources to do all this, but I can do this, that we end up at the same point. So I think there's something, prospective meta-analysis are preparing our field. Let's be very optimistic, right? Prospective meta-analysis are preparing our field that we can coordinate actions, work together for a year or something, and do the same study. And it is only a matter of time before we start to realize, but why wouldn't we expand this a little bit? And first, a couple of people are going to work on measurement development. And when they're done, these other people are going to take these measures and for 2 years use them in these kind of things. And we coordinate these things and solve issues that so far have proven too difficult to solve. So I think that's a pretty exciting future if we manage to coordinate in these ways. I don't know if we'll manage, but we're making small steps towards it, I think.
Next question comes from Tina Wong that I'll read aloud. Thank you for your thought-provoking talk. In your opinion, to what extent can the weaknesses of frequentist null hypothesis significance testing be overcome through the reduction of heuristic research practices? And I agree that heuristic practices are equally as damaging in the context of Bayesian analysis. For instance, desk rejection of anecdotal Bayes factor results. And I would also be interested to hear more of your thoughts on this issue.
Yeah, so I think there is a way to do frequentist hypothesis testing in a pretty interesting and informative way, right? So not just null hypothesis testing, but you make sure that the result is also interesting if you don't find something with an equivalence test. You can also test against not just the null, but something that actually matters. So you don't have this issue of practical significance versus statistical significance. And again, the vaccine studies that we rely on to decide which things, they used all of those techniques. This is the default way of designing experiments in medicine, and we can copy this and get pretty beyond a lot of these problematic aspects that people have complained about in null hypothesis testing. After we have done that, and we also use Bayes factors or other things correctly, we end up with a situation where it really doesn't matter so much which statistics we compute. People who've proposed Bayesian hypothesis testing, Jeffries, writes himself, look, I reanalyzed all the cases that Ronald Fisher discusses in his book. I find the same things using my method. And in cases where our approaches disagree, we should both be in doubt. People seem to think that this is a part that really matters, frequentist versus Bayesian statistics. But I think it's actually part of our normative behavior. we are being taught that we should have strong opinions about these things, but I don't think it really matters. You should have strong opinions about which philosophy of science you use. You should have strong opinions about the measurement practice in your field. And then in the end, yes, compute some numbers, an effect size, a base factor, a p-value, report them side by side and do a good interpretation of the results. And that's not the biggest issue, I think.
Next question from David Klonsky. He writes, thank you so much for this talk. One of the biggest mistakes I think the field is making right now is elevating pre-registration from a specific tool with useful applications to a heuristic or even a badge that signifies good research. Is this perspective consistent with your message, or would you characterize things differently?
It is completely consistent. And actually, I had some slides on this, but I left them out. I completely agree. So if you make pre-registration into a heuristic tool to evaluate whether a study is good or not, you're making a big mistake, right? That's not how it's supposed to work. I have a paper 2019 about what pre-registration does, and pre-registration doesn't mean your study is better or worse than a study that is not pre-registered in theory. I think we might be able to see that in practice, there are some differences, but that is an empirical issue in the future. But in principle, what a pre-registration does is it allows people to evaluate what we call the severity of a test. How much did you do an analysis to make sure that you got the finding that you wanted to find? And to what extent did you set up a test that could falsify your prediction, right? So looking at the method, you're like, okay, no, yeah, this seems a very valid test. I don't see any weird stuff happening here. This seems like a good test. Or you can say, look, they made changes to the analysis plan and now they find this thing. Now I believe it less. But this is all an evaluation of the severity of a test. And that is what you get out of it. Sometimes you don't need pre-registration. Sometimes I did studies where it was very clear I would just analyze reaction time. I had two conditions. I could only calculate the mean. I mean, there's almost no flexibility in there. It's also similar to 17 previous studies. I mean, there might be some room to, some room, but not a lot, Anyway, so I agree. It is, I think it is reaching this point. Another thing that is interesting about this, by the way, I want to flip the coin around, is also that there is a point where if somebody pre-registered, it is great. And then if you start to point out that there are actually problems with a pre-registered study, because, well, not surprisingly, research shows that most people don't pre-register their study very well. Of course not. We are not trained in it. We're trying to learn. I recently looked back to my old pre-registrations. Oh man, some from 2014. I was just ashamed of myself. It was so meaningless almost. Anyway, that's fine, I mean, 7 years later, I've learned a lot. I wouldn't do it like that again. But those pre-registrations were really bad, like horribly bad. Fine. But it's also that now if somebody pre-registers and it's not done very well, we can also not criticize them anymore because they have done what normative behavior is. And that is also part of the problem, I think. So anyway, I agree with the point. I hope it doesn't go that badly. But you see signs of it, definitely.
All right, next question from Ara Norenzayan. What's your take on the idea that there is a generalizability crisis in psychology, to use Talyakorny's term? Yeah, thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, I just got the proofs for this behavioral brain science thing, where there are, I think, an infinite number of comments on this. So I think that the question of whether there's a generalizability crisis or not depends a lot on what your philosophy on science is. What are we trying to do? And I think that what a lot of people try to do is not automatically make a claim that generalizes, which is what Talyakorny says that most people think that science is about. Like if they say, we found that money makes people happy, and you make a title that says money makes people happy, Talyakorny says, look, you're making a generalized claim that applies everywhere. Now, what I think we do is we make a claim that's a very basic statement about a data pattern in our study. Money makes people happy. But we mean it in a specific way, given a certain approach to doing science. If you do it correctly, this is sort of how it's supposed to work. Now, whether you think there's a crisis or not depends on how many people in your field you see doing a pretty good job. My background is more in cognitive psychology, and I see people do a relatively good job, I think, in making these basic statements and then not generalizing to all situations. I also think that if I ask you, if you see a title that says money makes people happy, and I say, do you want to bet that this is true for all situations everywhere? Do you want to bet your house on it? Nobody is going to actually take that bet, right? So we don't really think that this generalizes to everything. So this is a way that we communicate our findings. I'm happy to change that practice. I don't think it's very nice to make titles that say money makes people happy and these big claims that sound too general. I'm happy to do something about this. But I also think, yeah, I don't know. I don't feel a crisis. I'm not sure if you feel a crisis, but I don't feel a specific crisis about this. But there's stuff we can improve.
Right. Just to be thorough, I'll read this as well. Katya Damer says, this was great. Thank you, Daniel, for the great talk and others for the stimulating discussion. See you, smiley face emoji, wave emoji. And then Ryan has a question. Ryan Dwyer says, do you have any concrete suggestions about how the field can incentivize graduate students to invest in quality versus quantity? Real or not, there is the perception that you must publish many papers to get a job. As a grad student, time is limited, and heuristics typically save time and are quote unquote good enough to not raise eyebrows. Without incentives to improve quality, investing in quality likely puts you at a disadvantage.
Yeah. So first of all, I think we shouldn't put our problems on grad students, right? They're not the ones who have to solve these problems. I mean, you already have to solve the climate change, and we already put that on you. So you focus on that part, and let us try, as long as we're here, to fix science. So there's a couple of things we could do a lot better, right? There is so much uncertainty about this process of hiring, and we're not giving people a lot of good insights in this. If you apply for a job with me, I am not going to count the number of publications. I don't care. I hired a postdoc, and he said, you know, I published these 5 papers a couple of months later. And I thought, really? Did you do this? I don't know. I didn't look at your resume about those things. There was a fit between your expertise and the position that I needed to fill. You made a couple of good comments. I saw this one paper that I really liked. You know, I mean, the process is not just a counting of papers kind of thing. It's a multifaceted approach. We can be a little bit more proactive in telling people what we expect, you know, and maybe some people say, yeah, no, the more the better. If you want to get into this lab, you need to push out papers like crazy. Okay, but there is a lot of other room and a lot of other places, and people who are like, look, show me you can write. Give me 1 or 2 good papers. Of course, I expect that. But otherwise, don't go crazy. And what I want you to do is invest in good skills that I need. Become a good X, Y, whatever, you know, have some skills that complement my own. So we can do a lot about that in taking things, removing these uncertainties. I think that would be nice. I'm not sure about other ways in which we reduce this pressure on people. I have to say, I think it's pretty difficult things to do. Again, if we move to collective science, if you work at CERN, you would have published 100 papers by now. Nobody counts papers anymore at CERN. It's a completely irrelevant measure. It has become a completely irrelevant measure of performance. They look at other things, but not papers, because everybody is on all these papers. I would love to move to a system where, yeah, I mean, we all work on projects. You do a huge number of them. You contribute your skill, and that is it, sort of, you know. But that's not, like, graduate students can't do this. So for a graduate student, what I would do is stick with certain principles. Don't let yourself be driven crazy by these expectations. Do what you think is good science. What did you get into this business for? What do you think is a valuable contribution? And do that, because there's so much other stuff in the system that makes things uncertain, that makes you lucky or not, that works out or don't work out. You will never regret sticking to what you believe in as a graduate student. Also, if you don't have a career in science later, you did it the way that you wanted to do it, you know, and that is under your control. A lot of things are not under your control, but what you can control is, did I stick to my principles in this very difficult environment? It's also not easy, but it's a way that you won't regret what happens later on, I think. There's no way you're going to get into a midlife crisis because you stuck to your principles. But there will be a midlife crisis if you just try to publish like crazy and you've done it, and then what? You know, so.
Right, and then the last two comments from David Klonsky says, thank you so much. And the Mori Mikami says, thank you for your talk. And that puts us about at 2 minutes. So yeah, I think, thank you again so much. Really enjoyed your talk. And I think we all did as well. Again, this will be posted on the website for anyone who wants to see it. But yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Thanks for having me. Thanks. Bye.